Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Danielle Fisher, and I'm the event manager here at EcoCanada. And today's session is called Webinar Number 2, Adoption of Low Carbon Technology. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to recognize the traditional Indigenous lands where EcoCanada's office is based in Calgary. At EcoCanada, we're committed to working towards respectful acknowledgement, collaboration, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples across Canada. This starts with acknowledging our honor and privilege to live and work within the Treaty 7 territory. Today, we are presenting from the city of Calgary, home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. We would also like to take this time to acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Niitsitapi, home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina and Goodstoney, which include Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. Before we start, there are a few housekeeping guidelines for today's session to ensure that everyone can enjoy and participate in our session effectively. All participants are muted, so please check your audio settings to ensure that you can hear us properly. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please use the question box and select EcoCanada, the organizer, and I will do all that I can to resolve the issue. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand to you within the next 24 hours. Everyone who registered for the webinar will receive an email with a link to the video. Any questions that you have about the presentation or today's topic can be submitted through the chat box or question box. We will have dedicated time during the presentation to answer any questions from the audience. Finally, we really want to know what you think about our webinars and how we can keep improving. You'll be sent a short survey after the webinar ends. Please let us know what you think or if you have any comments or suggestions about the webinar. EcoCanada's vision is to build the world's leading environmental workforce. EcoCanada seeks to help environmental workers succeed at each step of their career journey. To do this, EcoCanada has developed programs tailored to individuals at different stages of their career. For those looking to enter the environmental workforce, EcoCanada provides training through the BEAR program and accreditation for environmental programs at post-secondary institutions. EcoCanada also provides opportunities for new workers to break into the environmental sector through wage funding for co-op students and recent post-secondary graduates. For those already employed as environmental workers, EcoCanada provides the environmental professional and environmental professional in training EPT certifications and EPT students. Lastly, EcoCanada provides opportunities for those with vast experience as environmental workers to provide guidance and direction to EcoCanada's products and programs through advisory committees and emeritus membership. Now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. First up, we have Shannon Wilson. Shannon is the project manager for Carbon Next and Build Next at Foresight Canada. As program manager, Shannon collaborates with the innovators to address the world's most critical challenges through carbon capture, utilization and storage, and carbon dioxide removal. Also on the panel is Sagar Kancharla. Sagar is the Director of Energy Transition, Advisory and Investments in Energy Resources and Industry at WSP Canada. Sagar is involved with advising organizations navigating the energy transition, in particular evaluating opportunities, enabling strategic decisions, and guiding successful executions. We also have Arvind Ramakrishnan. Arvind is a director at Deloitte in the Climate and Sustainability practice and leads the hydrogen pillar nationally. Arvind has over 20 years of industry experience in the utility sector, leading and developing low and zero carbon fuel market for the transportation sector in BC, including the marine segment. Over to you, Shannon.
Thank you, Danielle. As Danielle mentioned, I'm Shannon. I will be acting as the moderator for today's session. I'm really excited for this conversation with Arvind and Sagar. Just a little bit about Foresight before we kick this off. is Foresight is Canada's largest adoption and innovation accelerator. Our goal is to help the world do more with less sustainably. Next slide, Danielle. We do this through 4 areas of focus, which include our venture acceleration, where we meet innovators where they're at. We have a ramp of programming where we can support any innovators from ideation all the way up to commercialization and all across their TRL journey. We also have our adoption accelerator, where we work with industry to support their adoption of low carbon technologies and finding the right solutions for all of their problems. We have also developed a diverse capital network that leverages resources and can deploy capital to these innovators. And our 4th programming area is knowledge sharing. So we are working on developing tools, resources, and databases that make it easy to find and buy and sell these solutions. And next slide. Just a little bit on our climate and economic impact. We have supported almost 1,300 Canadian climate tech startups across Canada over our last 11 years of operation. We've run over 60 industry challenges where we work with industry to support them sourcing solutions for their climate problems. And through this program and other programs, we have supported the reduction of 70 megatons of carbon dioxide emissions. We've supported the companies find almost $2 billion in capital support and over $500 million in revenue. And then we've also supported the creation of almost 9,000 jobs across Canada. And just a little bit about Foresight. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sagar for his introduction.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Danielle and Shannon. As Danielle has introduced, I lead the Energy Transition Advisory at WSP Canada. What our group does is we basically complement the engineering talent that exists at WSP Canada in helping clients move from high carbon fuels and technologies to low carbon fuels and technologies. We tend to be agnostic to any technology, so we work across clean energy technologies. And we work with a diverse range of stakeholders, which could be policymakers, energy developers, consumers, uh, including campuses and financial institutions. Having said that, being agnostic to technologies, what we're seeing recently is a great interest in hydrogen economy. That means feedstock could either be power or natural gas. That means it makes us required to understand the various infrastructure for the feedstock as well as end use application technologies as well. In terms of the sectors we support, other than the supply side, there is definitely lots of activities these days related to transportation decarbonization, but we are seeing great interest in industrial and mining decarbonization these days. These organizations have completed taking inventory of their emissions and have set some targets, either it is 2030 emission reduction targets or by 2050. And now all of these organizations are engaging firms like us to evaluate low carbon technologies. A little more about me, having spent 25 years in the energy sector, it is exciting time to be in the sector now. When you're thinking about emissions and sustainability, you're really talking about energy consumption, right? And further, I'm finding it rewarding these days where your personal interests related to sustainability are converging with your career interests as well. Collaboration is key to achieving our sustainability goals, and it is so important to exchange our perspectives. And for that, I thank Eco Canada for organizing this webinars and share my perspectives along with Deloitte and Foresight representatives. Uh, Over to Arvind. Probably you want to provide an overview.
Yeah, thanks, Sagar, and I as well acknowledge and wanted to thank Eco Canada for giving us this opportunity today to share some of our perspectives and learnings. I joined you all from Langley, British Columbia, where I'm based. And as Danielle had mentioned, I lead the energy transition advisory practice, for particularly focusing on hydrogen and low carbon fuels. As a firm, we are involved in helping clients across the entire value chain from advisory through implement and operate. And specifically as it relates to energy transition, as we said again, the focus area has been on electrification, hydrogen, low carbon fuels, and on also carbon removal technologies, for which also we are seeing some significant amount of interest. Just some opening remarks on some areas of focus and industries that we are supporting. It is all coming from the philosophy that as we begin to realize that electrification alone cannot be scaled or deployed and decarbonized fast enough to meet our ambitious targets and cannot be the only answer. So I think more and more there is a recognition that there has to be a mix of different kinds of fuels, which are all in different technological plays and states and with different kind of policy support. And every one of this is equally important to achieve our ambitious net zero targets. So with that in mind, I think, as I mentioned, the focus today, and I'll keep this to more on the transportation side, industry, building heat as we navigate this conversation. Shannon, I'll turn this back to you.
Thank you, Arvind and Sagar. Before we dive into our questions, I just want to take a minute to frame out the goals of the session today. We all know Canada and our industries have made commitments to reach net zero across our operations, and we all know how large of an undertaking this actually is. Our goals for this conversation are to discuss at a high level the progress we have made as a country, areas where we can accelerate adoption of climate-friendly technologies, kind of those low-hanging fruits, and discuss some challenges we have encountered while doing this work. And with that, my first question for Arvind and Sagar is, and Danielle, if you can start the audience poll for this question as well, please. What are your thoughts about Canada's current progress in transitioning to a net zero carbon economy? Maybe I'll hand it over to Sagar first.
Sure. Should we give some time, or I can speak while the poll is going on? I just wanted to see if my response matches with the majority there or not before I give a response. No, let me respond to this question, Shannon. If you look at any statistics related to emissions, it'll show that we are making progress, albeit slow progress. And when you look at relative to the path of where we want to be to meet our 2030 objectives, probably we are lagging, right? And at the same time, we don't have to be too harsh on ourselves on the past performance. But there is definitely a need to create a sense of urgency now. Why I say that is past performance, how we started this decade, there have been some global disruptions coming out of the COVID. Then we had the geopolitical tensions. We had supply logistics, and now we are in a high inflation, high interest environment. It is to be expected that they will all these disruptions impact Canada as well. So we need to show resilience and get back on track to do better. One stat that I would like to do more to look at and monitor, Canada definitely ranks in 11th or 12th when you look at the total emissions. But when you look at emissions per capita, we jump to top 5. And this is a stat that I would like to see more reduction year on year as a performance. And that's something that we need to think about. Today, we'll be discussing low carbon technologies, but it is really important to recognize that energy efficiency technologies and conservation behavioral aspects play a significant role in meeting our emissions objective. At the same time, before I turn it over to Arvind, we should acknowledge that there are some positive signposts when it comes to policies introduction by all levels of government. We have clean electricity regulations, we have oil and gas caps, we have hydrogen strategies. So all these policies are contributing to bending the emissions curve. Again, it's a small turn, uh, but what is really required is it's not so much of announcement of new policies, but accelerated implementation of announced policies.
Okay, so I'll just jump in with the poll results here as well. So at the low end, we have 8% saying Canada is not making sufficient progress. Sorry, I can't make this a little bit bigger there. 32% are saying Canada's progress is slow and we need more aggressive policies. 52% say that Canada is making good progress, but there's still work to be done. And 8% is saying Canada is making excellent progress and is on track.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. I think those votes kind of land where we expected them to, where we do see some of the progress that's being made, but understand that there are gaps and areas where we can accelerate. Arvind, did you have anything to add to the current progress in Canada's transition?
Yeah, I'll just compliment to what Sagar said and don't want to repeat, but I also do agree with where the majority of the results have landed. And I'll just say that over the last few years, I think we have made some significant progress. And I'll just highlight a few areas. For instance, clean transportation, like Canada has taken a lot of steps to adoption of EVs and improve the infrastructure for EV charging. However, there are still challenges on the availability and affordability of EVs, as well as further need in charging infrastructure. And then as we go up the curve from medium duty and light duty to heavy duty, but also on the deep on the policy side to the ambitious targets we have by 2035 to decarbonize our electricity grid is an ambitious one, and we come from a position of advantage there where I think 90% of our grid is already clean. So, but we do have work there in other provinces. So that has been a very significant uptick and a big policy decision. And also largely, I think even in the energy efficiency side, we continue to make improvements in the energy efficiency in buildings, industry, and transportation. So I would say overall progress has been made, but yes, do agree that significant gaps do exist, especially as we start competing with our US jurisdictions as well for scaling and deployment of these technologies.
Absolutely. And we do have a question later to touch more on that point. So with that being said, maybe I'll go to Arvind first on this one. What are the big technology opportunities that would make the largest impact in this transition?
I'll start, and I think this is it's an interesting question because if you look at what the Canadian energy regulator has put out for our 2050 net zero ambition, there are of course a basket of different technologies that would have to be not just developed but also have to be scaled and scaled quickly enough to realize our big net zero ambition. So to start there, I would say, if you look at at the highest levels, we have electrification, low zero carbon fuels, direct air capture technologies, and energy efficiencies. Amongst those four big buckets, and then there is a very sectoral lens to each and every one of those, as we know, is transportation, industry, and building heat are some of the significant contributors of emission. So from that sectoral view and a fuels view, I think electrification is the answer to where we can electrify those end users where technology is ready, scaled, and deployed. However, there still remains an open question on the highest and best use of green electrons in the provinces and jurisdictions. It's a very jurisdictional view. We can get into that later, but overall, I would say, hydrogen, low carbon fuel technologies, especially some new technologies that are emerging, and the scalability of say technologies like methane pyrolysis, SMR with carbon capture storage, the hydrogen for heavy transport, the feedstock availability for sustainable aviation fuel and synthetic fuels, and again overall for industry as well, where we cannot electrify. I think those are all some of the technologies that I would say that have the biggest opportunities to make an impact. Sagar?
Yeah, probably I'll land it where your response has concluded as well, Arvind. But let me start off saying is probably it's a kind of non-committal response saying that Canada needs all of the possible technologies to accelerated emissions reduction, right? I think we need a portfolio of solutions. But to answer your question, Shannon, let's look at what the country is blessed with, right? We need to look at the natural resources that our country has, right? We are so fortunate that we have abundant wind, hydro, natural gas, and then also geological formations with such a land mass. Then you need to look at the clean energy technologies that can utilize these abundant resources and land formations. And when you start looking at that, then quickly you'll arrive at the technologies that Arvind has alluded to. You'll come up with yeah, let's have electrification, let's have biomass or biofuels related technologies and hydrogen. Right. So those are the three technologies kind of surface to the top, which can leverage the resources as well as the talent that you have. The good thing is all these technologies are different levels of maturity and complement each other. In some sectors, there'll be use of one technology versus the other. Take, for example, electrification. These are mature technologies like wind and solar hydro. So let's move fast on what we committed globally at COP28. We said we want to triple our renewable power resources and double our energy efficiency technologies by 2030. So that's where we need to start. And Arvind concluded saying that hydrogen is important. And when you look at the pathways for hydrogen, either it is electrons or molecules from the natural gas side. Those are the feedstocks. So that means there's more electrification needed. So electrification is needed both for just the power consumption as well as serves as a feedstock for hydrogen. So we need to focus a lot on generating power asset and then also the required grid connections across the country.
Great, thank you, Sagar. Yeah, I would definitely jump off of my lens is always going to be from a carbon management perspective. So that's just the stream that I work with and the innovators that I work with. But we have such a deep well of technical knowledge and the geology in Canada that we're at such a position where we could really lead kind of in that race. So it's really interesting to hear your perspective on that as well. We will jump to our next question, and I think we're having a bit of an issue with the slides, Sagar, so we're gonna need you to just not use them for this next one, I believe. But
Yeah, sure.
what approaches do you use when identifying new low carbon technologies for adoption?
Yeah, and I think there are different approaches to. I think if I understood the question, Shannon, is like how do organizations look at decarbonization, go about evaluating the various low carbon technologies? And there are different approaches. And people who have attended the first webinar, you would have seen a graphic that would show a structured approach of all the options energy efficiency, then you look at electrification, then you look at substitution with low carbon fuels, then you look at carbon capture. Even if that's not meeting your targets, then you look at carbon offsets, or maybe in some extreme position, you exit some of the operations as well. Right? So that's what you heard from the webinar structured approach. All this means is that we need significant infrastructure investments over the next 2-3 decades. In for evaluating these capital intensive projects, what we've seen is that if you just use the traditional techniques of looking at only the financial performance of these projects, we will not build anything, right? Because these are still emerging technologies that require significant support. That's why the traditional techniques of discounted cash flows may not be the ideal appraisal methodologies for evaluating these technologies. You need comprehensive frameworks that take into consideration your technical assessments, your economic job creation, and other metrics, along with the financial and ESG factors. And that's how I think the audience will can look at the document later on. At WSP, we developed a framework called Inspire, where it's basically a multi-criteria assessment, bringing together a quantitative, qualitative analysis of evaluating these various technologies on 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 multi-criteria. Just to illustrate one example, currently we're working with a mining company, and they have operations in a remote area, and they are looking at evaluating low carbon technologies that would get them off diesel. So we help the client evaluate 8 different technologies. We even looked at tidal and SMR as well, and developed a very comprehensive business case for them using this Inspire multi-criteria assessment framework, looking at all the factors. Just to illustrate a factor like the social and ESG, why it is important as well, as many of you could be familiar, some of these low carbon technologies, take for example, hydro could have a longer project life than the mining operations. So what we considered was, what if this, after the mine is closed, but you still have this generating source, could you transfer to the neighboring indigenous communities? That's how you're creating some social a value by when you're evaluating these technologies. Just one illustration to show that you need a multi-criteria framework to evaluate the adoption of these technologies. Thank you.
Thanks, Sagar. I will pass it over to Arvind.
Yeah, I think I'll just add a little bit. So just like Sagar mentioned, for WSP Delight, we have a framework as well where we have deployed with a lot of our clients in what we call as a scaling solutions framework. It's got a very similar approach to what Sagar said, where it takes a bit of a more of a holistic view towards understanding what is necessary for successful commercialization and integration of this new technology into the business. So here we are assuming it's an organization or a company in a particular sector that is interested in deploying this particular technologies. And the four big buckets that we typically use, which is very complementary to what Sagar said, is a technical pathway readiness, an operational readiness, a production value chain readiness, and lastly, the regulation and policy readiness. So within each and one of these buckets, there are a series of questions that we would go through and answer that ultimately aligns and matches with the ambition of the organization and where they are in their own journey, and help them understand the strategic choices they have and help them make those choices.
Great, thank you. Maybe jumping off of that, we'll talk a little bit about. We know that some of these technologies can be integrated in different sectors. So, what are the opportunities for cross-sector connection and sharing lessons learned from adopting technologies across sector lines?
I
Do
can
you want to
try,
go?
and Arvind, if you want to add to that, I think when you're looking at cross-sector, uh, collaboration is key, and sharing lessons across sectors is very critical. Take, for example, the electrification that Arvind was talking about. The technological developments that we've seen here are allowing us to heat our homes where we traditionally use natural gas, are helping us convert our transportation to electricity, and even power the low carbon solutions like hydrogen with electricity, right? And then also the technology developments through microgrid and storage systems. Some of the remote communities are having access to energy, right? So there are significant developments and cross-sector applications for the same technology that illustrated electrification. So in this context, and I think sharing ideas, sharing innovative business models would yield more success for adoption of these technologies.
Yeah, and I'll complement by giving a specific example. If you look at gas, electric distribution, utility systems across different jurisdictions, we all know that in the there is a lot of focus on electrification. I think it's equally important to note and understand the gas infrastructure that is at place and how do we decarbonize that. So an example that comes to mind, and a successful one that has been done in with Hydro Quebec and Energier in Quebec, is the introduction of hybrid gas heat pumps, and that's an excellent technology whereby gas and electric systems are both symbiotic and dependent on each other. There is a lot of cross-sectoral collaboration happening between both gas and electric systems when you start using technologies like hybrid heat pumps, because then you are relieving the electric capacity at the coldest days and utilizing the natural gas, and you're using electricity during the times when there is not that peak demand for power. So those are some great examples that have come in those strategic relationships and engagements, and that's a kind of innovative examples and cross collaboration that we would want to see across different sectors and looking at more joint integrated system planning activities. And I think there is a role for federal government, if I look at somebody like NRCan, given their convening power, to start bringing some of these best practices, ideas, and lessons learned across different pilots, to be able to provide that to a lot of different stakeholders to make more informed decisions in a timely manner, which will ultimately expedite uh, the ambitious target that we have.
Thanks, Arvind. I love that example you had with Energir in Quebec. I had an opportunity to hear from them earlier this year, and learning about that project was really interesting. I also had an opportunity to talk with an energy regulator, and they've actually been working with water regulators and learning the flow of water and the flow of electricity have some similarities, and they can learn from each other in deploying different technologies and finding solutions. So I think this cross-sector pollination will continue and is really important as we progress through this transition. On to our next area of focus. So, what challenges and barriers have been encountered in the adoption of low carbon technology, and what strategies have been successful in overcoming these obstacles? Go to Sagar first.
Sure, I can. There are quite some challenges, but at the same time, I think these are things that we learn by doing. Uh, the first one I can think about, which comes to top of mind, it's not necessarily only related to low carbon technologies. These are really related to large capital projects, and probably this is where my engineering firm hat comes up. Is really related to permits and regulations, right? And we need to think out ways to accelerate the approval of these clean energy projects. And yeah, agreed that there's not much history to look at. Take for example some of the large hydrogen projects or the others. But we need to look at ways that can accelerate the permits and the regulatory process. So I think we are in a situations where most of our clients and others are saying we had enough of studies now. I think as a consultants, we like to do more studies, but they're really looking for is like I like to see more backhoes on the construction sites, right? And I think that's where some of the challenges uh, the low carbon technology developers are facing. I think in terms of how do we mitigate them, it's really looking at can we pre-approve some of the site locations for environmental assessments before as they go through the project developments, right? Like when you move from scoping to feasibility, pre-feasibility, and finally come to a final investment decisions, is there a way that we can accelerate these approvals in between? That's one thought. I think there's something else will come to my mind, but I'll pass it on to Arvind, and I'll pick up again.
Yeah, I think Shannon, this is a broad question, and what are the barriers in adoption of low carbon technologies, and what strategies have been successful? Because as I said again, it's a very depends on sector and a very fuel particular view. So it's very sectorally focused and fuel focused. But I'll take a stab at making it a little bit more generic, and I put them in like in addition to infrastructure and permitting that Sagar touched on. Maybe I'll touch on like affordability. Like affordability is one of the principles for the federal government, and that still continues to be a big barrier. Like what we have seen is Canada and policies are great in incubating technologies here. And suddenly, when they reach to TRL 5 or 6 or 7, those fundings disappear and they rely on private funding and, more importantly, the demand to scale up. And that's when typically technologies are born here, but they're not able to grow up and scale. And then they move to other jurisdictions. And there are numerous examples of those. So having a very careful eye to those kinds of technologies which are in growth stage, and making sure the policies and funding mechanisms and incentives are directed towards those particular buyers and users and technologies which have a huge potential to scale up, I think has to be a very considerate and a very surgical view in policy making towards those particular technologies in particular. I would say the other one that comes top of mind is just more broadly is also limited awareness and understanding. I mean, there is also generally, it comes back to energy literacy as well. There is certainly still a lack of energy understanding and awareness of different technologies, the end users. We are all in the space and field, so we understand it. But for general public to understand and support, I think there is more that can be done by the ecosystem in generally in raising the energy literacy of some of these technologies and the role of different energy systems and the symbiotic nature and the relationship that they have. Um, and the last one I would say is also more on in that goes around is around Sagar's point is just around infrastructure and regulatory barriers. For instance, I'll give a specific view. Sagar mentioned about permitting, but I'll talk about like in terms of in now utilities are being asked to make distribution utilities are being asked to make these investments in the net zero transition, but the regulator whom they have to go to seek approvals, their mandate is still cost and causation principles, and they're still relying on principles like bond right principles, and yet do not have the mandate to look at social and climate. So even expanding the regulator's mandate to start into looking at some social and climate aspects are also equally crucial to expedite decision making. Pause here. Sagar, anything to add? I know you said you would want to
Yeah,
come
I
back.
think this could be a topic on its own, Arvind. But the other thing I think you touched upon is really the access to capital, right? I think that's where it is really needed for government support in the initial years when you're talking about this nascent technologies, that there is some funding programs, and Canada has come up with some good programs. It's just that we want to see them start flowing, like the investment tax credit and other incentives as well. And then also the private sector is stepping up and having skin in the game through some investments as well, right? So uh, the access to capital is also a challenge, but we've seen the developments in the renewable power earlier, and how the funding is now freely available, like the access to capital. Even uh, technologies like offshore wind also has some precedence for emerging technologies like hydrogen and CCS as well. So we should start seeing more investment sources for these technologies.
Right, thank you, Sagar. I'll open up to Arvin if you have any additional thoughts.
Um, I mean, I think we touched on a lot about obstacles and barriers, but also on some of the solutions and what's working. I think there are lots of policy instruments and lots of actions that the government and the industry is taking that actually is working, and it is going in the right direction. I mean, example, if you look at hydrogen in particular, some of the policy mechanisms in place today and the MOUs that have been executed between Canada and Germany that we are seeing is a strong signal and a sign of support by federal government. The recent passing of the ITCs to allow 40% of the investment tax credits, and the Canada Growth Fund, the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Like there's lots of those policy instruments and mechanisms, and if they're the stackability, I think is a key one. And if you're able to stack them to provincial and federal programs, it does make the cost of these low carbon, zero carbon fuels cost competitive. I think the key is to be able to make sure to co-locate supply and demand at the time and ensure that there is sufficient offtake. And I think those kind of targeted instruments that are going towards the demand side, I think we'll start seeing the traction that we need.
Great, thank you. I definitely agree. There has been a lot of signals lately in the ecosystem broadly, and with what the government at both the provincial and federal levels have been working on to move a lot of this forward. So that's always a good sign. Um, Maybe just diving off that a little bit. So when we're talking about these new technologies that sometimes can be categorized as untested or novel, or they have inherent risk with deploying them into these industries. So how do you work with kind of historically risk adverse industries that are, required to meet certain financial targets every year, and implementing new technology and adding that risk can be a bit of a challenge for them. So how do you work with these industries through this process?
Yeah, I can share from my experience working with the clients. And I think when we approach our clients for any investment decisions, that seems to become our tagline, where we try to inform them that, like, you need to strengthen your business case and de-risk your investments. That's where uh, the the stakeholders that are looking at implementing low carbon technologies to look at that. One perspective, we talked earlier about access to capital. And when I speak to many of the financial institutions, because that gives a perspective of how can you get access to capital, because that's one concern that many of these developers have, those risk averse, as you said, Shannon. And they talk about three areas that need to be de-risked. One is related to the technology, right? It could be related to, I think Arvind was talking about TRL, but how can the technology providers provide you support throughout uh, the project life cycle? So it's not just at the initial stages. So that gives confidence to the risk averse developer. The other area is a little biased, is really that somebody is there to build it, right? Like this related to the EPC risk that exists as well, right? Because these are new technologies, uh, you don't know when the commissioning period is. And you need to de-risk that, and it doesn't go over budget and meets the timelines, right? So EPC risk is one. And the third important thing that financial institutions look at is really the offtake agreements. And this one is really challenging in the sense that you're making an investment which has a life of 25, 30 years or so, but it's been challenged to get an offtake agreement for 5 years, right? And there is a renewing of contract risk there. So how can you get a long-term offtake contract? So there are again, talk about collaborations. There is a role for all players in the value chain, whether it's the government, technology providers, end use applications, the developers need to invest and mitigate this risk.
I
Thank you,
can add.
Sagar. Yeah, go
Um,
ahead, Arvind.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what Sagar said. I think I agree with a lot of what he's already mentioned. But I would say when we look at risk, again, it depends on who the proponent is and what sector they're operating and where they are in their journey and life cycle and what decisions are they trying to make. So given all that context, we fundamentally look at risk in 7 different categories or buckets. Then one is the energy supply risk. For instance, what we mean by that is if I'm a large hydrogen producer, getting access to clean power and the capacity guarantee is also a bit of a risk at this stage, depending on in which provinces they are and what the capacity and the availability of that power is. In many cases, new capacities will have to be developed, transmission lines will have to be developed, or even new tariffs, depending on what the ask is. We talked about the infrastructure risk already in terms of the readiness and availability to deploy projects, the permitting risk, technical risk that Sagar already touched upon. There's a lot of market risk as well in terms of whether the intended product, in case of this large hydrogen producer developer, if it is going for export markets or domestic markets. So how do you scale and size the projects, and what is the maturity of the demand, and how will the demand move over time? Policy risk as well, given the political climate and the environment we find ourselves in things like carbon pricing and the stability of those. I mean, those are important decisions when for investors, if they have to fund investments on large scale projects. And then finally, there is a lot of social risk as well, which goes into indigenous engagements and partnerships and community outreach and community acceptance and support. And the last finally is about just the partner risk, because there's a lot of partnership and collaboration and cooperation happening. So any uncertainty in this ecosystem also leads to risk. So we look at all these different risk parameters, the level of risk, the probability of the impact, and what specific strategies will have to be deployed to be able to overcome all this risk.
Absolutely. Risk is something when you're working with innovators that you hear all the time, whether it's technological risk, financial risk, etc. So I think that was some great insights on that role. The next question we have is, talking a lot more about policy and regulations. We touched on it briefly, but maybe going into how they can play a significant role in supporting this transition, like areas where we could focus and support, um, not to use the word again, but low-hanging fruit in this space is also really helpful to touch on.
Arun,
I
do you want
can
to start? You worked
I can
closely with
start.
lots of agencies.
Yeah, I can start. Certainly, we're doing a lot of work right now on development of hydrogen hubs and corridors, and also development of zero carbon transportation corridors. So I think if you look at the readiness use case, and let's just talk about electrification and low zero carbon fuels. I mean, transport is one sector that we would say is ready for adoption. Again, depending on the scale of transportation, if you look at light duty and passenger cars, we're already seeing the uptick with EV adoption. So that I would say is the strategy there is again very different in terms of making sure that there's availability of those models, and we are seeing that, but also affordability of those at a price point of where we buying gasoline powered cars today, and of course the availability of infrastructure to be able to support so we can charge where we can. I think we're already seeing that transition happening in medium duty and light duty, where there is significant amount of focus right now is in the medium duty and heavy duty. And what we mean by that is class 6, 7, and 8 sector. There is a lot of trials and pilots happening in Western Canada, Eastern Canada, Midwest, and we are supporting a few of those and learning about these trials and pilots, the technologies in particular, and what needs to happen. But the key issue there is to be able to ensure there is availability and scalability of those particular technologies. And what we mean by that is specifically in class 7 and 8 trucks, there is both electrification and hydrogen and low carbon fuels competing for some of those end users right now. I think time will tell in terms of how those technologies move and evolve over time, but also that is where a lot of policy clarity also comes, and more so residing on provincial governments and provinces and jurisdictions to be able to clearly come out and say, let's carve out electrification where it makes sense today, light duty, medium duty, class 3, 4, 5, but class 6, 7, and 8 segments where maybe for short range, yes, but for long haul applications, aviation, marine, I think there's a clear role for low zero carbon fuels, i.e. hydrogen, ammonia, methanol. And I think that's where more policy needs to be more certain and directive so that these technologies um, can start scaling. And that's just one industry and one example of transport where we talked about, and also the cost and affordability. Like a hydrogen truck still costs about $800,000 to $1.2 million. So to be able to bring the cost down and even the cost of hydrogen down, like we're seeing north of $15 a kilogram, and what some of our modeling suggests, it has to come around the $5 a kilogram range to be able to be competitive. I spoke a lot there. I'll pause here and maybe I'll just let Sagar also chime in.
No, it's good to hear your first-hand experiences with these projects. My thought when it comes to policies and regulation is that it's easy for us to look towards government for all the help we need, right? And so, I, and yeah, definitely there can be more done from the government. But I think there's a significant role for all the players and the stakeholders, right? And the policies, regulations. Why I say that, when it comes to government's participation, definitely they can play a big role when it comes to funding and incentive programs. The areas I like to see further progress is really having a strong carbon signal, right? I still think that if you're looking at adoption of low carbon technologies, a strong carbon signal will help the market transition towards low carbon technologies. And the other area we start seeing is most of the incentives so far have been predominantly on the supply side, which are needed, which are good, right? And it's nothing is lost by having funding for or in ITCs for hydrogen or CCS side. That's good, but we like to see more on the demand side incentives as well. And there has been some start there as well. We saw the introduction for contracts for differences, such programs. So those would all help as well. I think those are a couple of suggestions that we like to see. But it's more important is like I'm very pleased with the policies and directional really where the various governments at all levels have developed the policy. It is more as like how do we accelerate the implementation of these announced policies? That's where I think governments could do some more work.
I
Okay,
see. Yeah.
great. We do have some questions from the audience that I'd like to ask you guys. They've just popped up. So our first question is from Kangana, and they're asking, what specific opportunities and challenges do Canadian provinces face in adopting low carbon technologies? And how can regional policies be tailored to support local innovation and implementation?
I can take a first cut at this, Arvind, and you can add some more. When it comes to regional policies, as Arvind and I were mentioning earlier, uh, we as a nation, we are so blessed with resources across the nation, and these resources vary from province to province. So it is really important to leverage that particular province's natural resources and talent availability, right? And sometimes it is also access to export markets. Maybe on the west and east coast, you want to develop some technologies which helps the domestic markets through economies of scale by providing exports. Or some province could blessed with more uh, uh, say for example wind on the Atlantic side, especially Newfoundland, all the developments that we're seeing in the green hydrogen space. So the policies need to be tuned to the local resources that are available that the particular province can capitalize on. That's my thought is have a very regional focus based on what is available for you, whether it is from a production perspective or from the demand perspective. Arvind, anything?
Yeah, I think I would add by saying that it's a great question, by the way. So thanks for the question, and it's one that is quite again quite broad. And I think we have seen the introduction from provinces and jurisdictions. Let's say if it's a hydrogen strategy or a clean or in a case of BC, a clean BC priority. Like every province now has a mandate or a target that they have established in how they want to align themselves with federal targets and federal ambitions. And again, speaking of hydrogen in particular as an example, every province has now released a hydrogen strategy and their roadmap and what actions and priorities they want to take. Now, having said all of that, in my view, there are these five layers of innovation. There is policy, incentives, regulation, business, and technology. So under every one of those particular pillars, every province and the territories will have to think through how they want to align themselves. For example, in terms of incentives, like what role can the provinces play to be able to stack some of their own incentives and stack it up with federal incentives, so they're not competing for it but more enabling some of those, because every jurisdiction is so specific with their regional geographic mix, the resource mix, their policy mix, as Sagar mentioned, their availability of talent and capital. So it's very, very regional focus. But having that view and understanding across these five lenses that I talked about, I think would be an important dimension for provinces to consider. So it's a lot about making sure there is just coordination and collaboration between not just within that province, but across more regionally, and also with federal government and priorities. I think would be a key one. I'm not sure we have entirely answered the question there, but it is broad in nature.
Yeah, you
Um,
had, and something triggered, Arvind, just to complement what you just said. There is, again, as much as I said, like each province could be different, but it also each province could learn from other provinces as from their policies. Like one program I think I totally admire it as a success is the BC LCFS program. If you see the transportation and the clean energy adoption there, it is the success of this program. There's a nice active market there for credits, and so much so the federal government has come up with a similar program. So there's a lot to learn from other provinces as well.
Okay, so the
Yeah.
questions have started to pour in. I'm just going to interrupt for a second here. I just want to let everyone know that we will get through as many questions as possible. If we do not answer your question in this webinar, I will forward them to the panelists and they can reach out to you. Sorry, Shannon.
No worries. I was just going to add to that Sagar's comments spurred something for me. The Alberta Tier program as well has also
Yeah.
been really
Yes.
valuable and for getting emissions down, but then also funneling a lot of that money that they collect from the program into innovation. So looking at that model and how it's worked has also been really successful, and I think other provincial areas can learn from that.
Amazing. Okay, so we have a question from Trevor, and Trevor's asking, currently, which specific sector in Canada is calling WSP or Deloitte for this most support with emissions reductions? Is it governments? Is it mining? Is it O&G? Is it commercial operations, or is it something else?
I can go.
Uh,
Depending on the nature of the problem that they're trying to solve and the sector and where they come from, I would say in terms of energy transition in particular, there is just a lot of activity, at least we are seeing in our firm, across government and public services. So federal government, provincial governments, and also other like airports and transit authorities, and then of course also within what we call as energy resources and industrial sectors.
Yeah, just to add, as you can imagine, like whether it's Deloitte or WSP, being a multidiscipline and large organizations, there's lots of activities in all sectors as well. But what we're seeing a lot of activity from end use application is people are realizing that 2030 is not far off, right? And they have established these targets. So lots of queries from industrial and resource companies where they've established these emissions reductions targets, and they're looking for quickly some asset-based solutions that could help them with their objectives as well. So definitely lots of industrial activity, and I'm sure it's true for Deloitte and us as lots of activity on the transportation sector as well, and rightly so. Right? Like Canada, that is the highest emission sector, and we need to focus on that.
So we have a question from Susan, and Susan is asking, what is your view on battery energy storage systems role playing in the overall decarbonization solutions?
Yeah, it has a significant role just because of the renewable power that which by nature it is intermittent, right? So uh, any storage solutions would help with not overbuilding the power generation sources. And then also, we need more of them. So, the storage solutions and technological developments, like the previous technologies, are helping with the reduction in costs. And it is not just these short duration projects that the question is posing related to battery energy storage systems. There's a big role for long duration energy storage as well. If you look at hydrogen fuel cells, or if you look at uh, air compression related, uh, I think the storage solutions would become more and more critical. And the other advantages is not just from an emissions reduction perspective. I think why it excites me when I see the storage solutions being technological developments is now we can reach out to remote communities and develop some microgrids with BESS systems or LDS systems, not necessarily have this hundreds of kilometers of transmission lines, which are so uncertain. And so these remote communities are now benefiting from energy that all of us in well connected cities have benefited for long, thanks to storage systems.
Yeah, I would add saying that the biggest, first of all, I would acknowledge and saying battery energy storage systems has a huge role to play in our net zero ambition. And I'll touch on a few specific examples and use cases in addition to what Sagar mentioned. I think first is, as we have this ambition to decarbonize our grid with more intermittent nature of renewable sources such as solar and wind, I think having battery energy storage technology it can release that stored energy when generation falls short. So this ensures a more reliable and stable integration of renewable energy into the grid, and this is extremely important, for as you know as to decarbonize our grid and provide reliable and affordable and resilient power systems. The other is also grid stability and reliability, because if you balance supply and demand fluctuations in real time, battery energy storage system has that capability, which can again provide enhanced reliability of the grid, and reduce the need for fossil fuel backup power plants. And the last thing I would add is also more on peak shaving and load shifting. So battery energy storage systems again has that particular ability to reduce strain on the grid during high demand periods.
That brings us to the end of our webinar. If there's any last words that our panelists would like to say, please do so now, and we'll end the webinar right afterwards. But this will be sent out to your inboxes within 24 hours, this recording. Any questions that were unanswered, I will make sure that they get to the appropriate panelists. I just wanted to thank you guys so much for this. It was very informative, and my apologies for the few slides that weren't shown. So again, wonderful presentation. Any last words?
I just wanted to chat quickly about a program we have here at Foresight. So every year we witness remarkable advancements in clean tech across Canada. Behind each innovation is a dedicated team offering hope for a future as they lead the way to net zero. The Foresight 50 is a competition to find the 50 most investable clean tech ventures in Canada and support their growth through investor matchmaking and profiling. This is our fourth year running the program, and previous winners have gone on to secure significant capital partners and investor connections from this program. If you know an amazing Canadian clean tech innovator that should be recognized on this list, please reach out to us, and applications are open until this Friday. And thanks so much, Eco Canada, for having us on this webinar today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank
Sounds like
you
an
all.
amazing
My last
effort.
message is let's move from commitment to action when it comes to adoption of clean technologies. Thank you, everyone, whoever is tuned in.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.